Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Impossible State podcast at CSIS. My name is Victor Cha. I'm Senior Vice President for Asia and Korea Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown University. This podcast is hosted by Andrew Schwartz and myself, and I'm playing the role of host today. And we're very happy to welcome our good friend Ramon Pacheco Pardo to the Impossible State podcast. For our viewers and listeners, let me properly introduce Ramon. He is a professor of international relations at King's College London and holds the KF-VUB Korea Chair at the Brussels School of Governance in Brussels. So you are basically the European equivalent of me, right? You are the EU Korea Chair, but of course you're younger and much more dynamic and more handsome than I am. So Ramon is also the King's College Regional Envoy for East and South Asia, helping to shape and implement the university's strategy for the region. He is an adjunct non-resident fellow with us here at CSIS, but also a non-resident fellow with the Sejong Institute and a committee member of CSCAP EU. His publications include the books Shrimp to Whale, South Korea from the Forgotten War to Kpop, published by Hearst and Oxford last year. That's a great book. We used it in my class this semester. And North Korea-U.S. Relations from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, published by Routledge in 2019. He's also has been editor for Millennium, the journal Millennium, and sits on the editorial boards of East Asia and International Quarterly, EU-China Observer, and the Global Studies Journal. He holds a PhD in International Relations from the LSE, which I guess is now called the London School of Economics and Political Science. Right? Anyway, Ramon, you're a good friend of CSIS. We're happy to have you back on the show, and happy to talk about something new for our listeners that is forthcoming. A book that we co-authored. If we could pull up the cover of the book, that would be great. This is a book that we chose to. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about why we chose to write this book?
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction.
Sure.
I don't know about handsome, but thanks for the introduction. Yeah. I think this book, when we first started talking about it, if I remember correctly, which actually was here at the CSIS, remember we had a meeting, and I think we both felt that there was a need for an academically informed book for the general public that discuss the history, analyze the history of the two Koreas, the modern history of the two Koreas, late 19th century until today. It's really updated until the current administration in South Korea, for example, the Yoon administration. And I think that's when we started looking at the possibility of co-authoring this book, because we wanted to bring, of course, the American perspective that you bring, plus your experience as a practitioner, and the European perspective as well, that maybe is less well known. And then we combine the academic research we have done, our experiences as well. In your case, of course, dealing with North Korea, working for government, in my case, also talking to North Koreans, South Koreans as well, both of us. And then that's how we put the book together.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it was a very fun collaboration. It's actually my first collaboration. All the other books I've written have been single authored. So so this was completely painless, and it was actually a lot of fun. Where do you think, again, for our readers and listeners, if we can pull up a picture of the book cover? I know it's behind us, but that would be great as well. Where do you think this book sort of fits in the literature on Korea? There it is. There's a cover. There's a cover of the book for all of our, I guess not our listeners, but our viewers. Here's a cover of the book. It's this is being published by Yale University Press. They chose the color hot pink for the cover. I guess it will stand out on a bookshelf if we see it, and not to be blatantly self-promoting, but there is the webpage at Amazon where you can purchase the book. As you can see, it will be released on June 27th, 2023. So anyway, Ramon, where do you think this book sort of fits in the literature on Korea right now?
I think I would say is an informed introduction to the modern history of Korea. So in my view, when we're co-authoring it, I was thinking of someone who has some interest in Korea, maybe because of Kpop, maybe because of North Korean nuclear weapons, and they want to learn more about the history of the two countries. First of all, obviously, as a unified country later on after the division, and how everything fits together, but also the relationship between both. And I think that's something I particularly enjoyed, that we divide the chapters on North Korea on the one hand, South Korea on the other hand, but we pull them together to actually look at the relationship and how they compare to each other. And I think that's something that stands out maybe from other books that really treat them as separate entities, and I think that's something we really try to avoid with the book.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I liked about it was the way, and it was particularly in your chapters, because I did sort of the earlier chapters on the late 19th century and the Korean War, and you did sort of the more contemporary chapters, was the way that you pulled together both the narrative of Korea and the narrative of North Korea and the narrative of South Korea together in the same chapter, covering a certain period of time. So you see the evolution, or in North Korea's case, the devolution of these countries over time. You see how the trajectories start out at the same, and then they gradually start to change. So that made it really interesting. The other thing I really liked about the book, and I particularly liked about your chapters, is you write about something we don't often talk about when we talk about Korean politics and society, and we don't often see it in the history books about Korea. Is you talk about things like the women's movement and how that was important for democracy, and also the growth of the LGBTQ plus community. Right, these are not things we often see in books, history books on Korea, and I think it makes it a unique piece of work. When I thought about this project with you, I always felt like the book that everybody read when they read the history of Korea was to read the book that the famous Don Oberdorfer wrote, The Two Koreas. I mean, you've read the book, I've read the book, you've assigned the book, I've signed the book. It's a great book. It's a terrific book, but it's been many years since that was published. And so we're hoping that this book will help to fill some of the void of the Oberdorfer book, though it's still a terrific book. So again, we're happy with the unusually bright pink color of the cover, the tigers, and the book will be coming out in June 27th, and is now available on Amazon. But let's move on to other topics, and in particular, I wanted to, on the last episode of The Impossible State, we had sort of a deep dive with Jin Myung Kim of Chosun Ilbo on the summit. And not that we should talk about the summit forever, but I'd love to sort of get the view from Europe. What was the Europe view of the Yoon state visit to Washington?
For me, to begin with, the most interesting thing is that there was a lot of attention, many media requests to discuss a summit that wasn't involving Europe. At the end of the day, it was involving the US and Korea. And I think there was a lot of emphasis in Europe on two matters. One of them, economic security, is a very big issue in Europe. There's a lot of talk about China, as there is obviously here in the US, and there is, of course, in Korea and the region. So a lot of talk about what are Korean firms, what is the Korean government going to do together with the Biden administration, not only the investment by different Korean firms that we are seeing here, but the visit to MIT, for example, right, in which innovation was being discussed. Because I think from a European perspective, we've seen, for example, European leaders, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte going to Korea to discuss this explicitly, right? Can Samsung, other Korean firms invest in Europe as well as they are doing here? But how can there be cooperation? For example, there's the Chip for Alliance. How can there be cooperation between Dutch firms, for example, that are also involved in the semiconductor business, potentially with the Chip for Alliance? So there was a lot of interest on that component. And there was also quite a bit of interest on the links between Russia and China. I think the link that in the US has been discussed for a longer period of time. In Europe, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has become a very hot topic because of the no limits partnership between China and Russia. So there was a lot of interest to see, for example, in the statement what was going to be written about Ukraine, but also, for example, about China or the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, because Europe is looking more at this region. It's looking more at having its own, for example, the EU, its own coordinated maritime presence in what is essentially South China Sea, even though it's not called in this way, but from a European perspective, the more navies from like-minded partners, US of course, but Korea, Japan, Australia, the better. So there was a lot of interest on this discussion as well.
Interesting. I just on Ukraine, that what struck me was that the paragraph in the joint statement on Ukraine was very prominently placed at the very top of the joint statement, which I thought was quite unusual. Usually the top thing is North Korea. That was buried somewhere underneath, but it was sort of the main featured item in the joint statement after the introductory paragraphs, which gives one a sense that Yoon is really committed to helping to defend Ukraine in whatever way that Korea can.
No, not only that, I mean, he mentioned this in his speech, for example, right, to the session of Congress, and again, I got many media inquiries also from European officials, of course, and media inquiries about the speech itself, which, again, I found surprising because it's not necessarily something that Europe would have cared about in the past. A Korean president, in this case, giving a speech to the UN session of Congress, and there was a lot of questions about Ukraine being mentioned not only in the UN statement, as you mentioned, but also in the speech as well. So that was quite interesting to see how that was the main focus. Very few questions about North Korea, as you mentioned. I think from a European perspective, I wouldn't say it's a non-issue because it is an issue, but it's really secondary, differently from what it would have been a few years ago. Obviously, when President Trump was in office, there was a lot of questions about it, and not anymore, actually.
Yeah, interesting. The other thing you mentioned was that there is a lot of interest in the China aspect of this, and so I would like to go to that because that was sort of the main topic that we advertised for this episode of The Impossible State. So, and this still relates to the joint statement in that. So there are a number of passages in the joint statement that really are quite unprecedented in terms of the target, I would say, of these statements. So just for our listeners, let me just point to some of these. One of them is about economic coercion, right, in which the two leaders say, quote, "We share deep concerns about and express opposition to harmful uses of economic influence, including economic coercion, as well as use of opaque tools with respect to foreign firms, and will cooperate with like-minded partners to counter economic coercion." It's pretty clear who that's about, right? That's about China. If you go a couple of paragraphs down, I think this is sort of the key paragraph. It says, quote, "The presidents reiterated the importance of preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element of security and prosperity in the region. They strongly opposed any unilateral attempts to change the status quo in the Indo-Pacific, including through unlawful maritime claims, the militarization of reclaimed features, and coercive activities. Yoon and Biden also reaffirmed their commitment to preserve unimpeded commerce, freedom of navigation and overflight, and other lawful use of the sea, including in the South China Sea." So, end of quote. So that's a pretty big statement in the U.S. ROK bilateral joint statement. What has been the Chinese reaction to this?
I think China has been quite clear that it doesn't like the direction of travel of South Korean foreign and defense policy and economic policy, and very openly critical. And what I find interesting is that in the past China may have done this behind closed doors, but now it's being very open about it. We have seen this not only in Chinese media, but as spokespeople from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For example, I mean, if you recall back when the Indo-Pacific strategy was released, the South Korean Indo-Pacific strategy in December, the following day, there was already criticism from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, very pointed criticisms, essentially saying that from their perspective, South Korea has chosen sides. But what I find, from my perspective, more interesting, because I focus more on the South Korean side, is that South Korea is hitting back. It's not bowing his head. He's not apologizing. And he's actually saying, well, this is our foreign policy, and this is not the way to deal with a partner or not a partner, sorry, with a neighbor, right? That is in the same region. And I find this interesting because I think in the past, South Korean politicians may have taken a step too far, but you don't see this anymore, right? You actually see ambassadors being called consultations. You see the South Korean government saying China is being undiplomatic and in a sense directly responding to this criticism. And I actually think that, I always said actually, not with the current administration, but going back to previous administration, that in my view, South Korea should be more assertive for lack of a better word, because it has its own assets. Yes, China is the bigger economy and it's a stronger military power. El very less has a bigger military and of course bigger military spending. But South Korea is not a minor anymore, right? So in the same way that other countries, Australia in the past, for example, have responded to China, in my view, that's something that South Korea should do. And understand, of course, why some South Korean policymakers and business people are concerned. But, you know, coming from Europe, if China is going to criticize a country, it's going to find a reason to do so, right? And I think with South Korea, they will find a reason to criticize South Korea. They've done it with TAD, of course, in the past with unofficial economic sanctions. They even criticize the Moon government when it talked about COVID-19, about the origins of COVID-19, and now very openly criticizing the Yoon government.
Yeah. If we could pull up the slide, I wanted to show one other thing to our viewers. I think that it's interesting. So this is, I just wanted to show this to our viewers. So this is from the Global Times, and it just gives you a sense of how this is, as Ramon, as you said, this used to be something that was discussed behind closed doors between the two sides, but now it's sort of open in the press. And you can see here in particular, there's the opening part of this statement that was in the Global Times about a letter that was sent by the South Korean embassy in China to the Global Times in a formal protest for the way that they had reported on the Yoon visit and the way that they had talked about Yoon. The South Koreans basically took offense at that, and they've lodged a foreign protest with the paper, which the paper has now published and has fought back on, has slapped back on. So this is now out in the open. This is a very open dispute between the two sides. In one sense, it's not surprising because when the Yoon government started and when they came to CSIS, when a transition team came to CSIS, their messages were very clear. They said very clearly they wanted to, the United States relationship was primary, and very clearly that they wanted to improve relations with Japan and focus on economic security. So they were very clear about certain things, but on China, it was very neutral, sort of just important neighbor, important economic partner. What's the term they use? Mutual respect, right? Mutual respect, good relationship, but that was it, right? And I think you're right. We're seeing that over time it's becoming clearer and clearer the position that the Yoon government is taking. And I think the Chinese at first wanted to keep it sort of suppressed. They didn't want it to come out into the open because it's kind of embarrassing to them. But now, because of what we saw in this summit, it's now very much in the open. And our friend, the ROK ambassador in China, is probably very busy, or Chung Jae-ho is probably still current Seoul National University professor of international relations, China expert, who is now the ambassador in Beijing. Our friend, I think, is probably very busy now, having to deal with the aftermath of the joint statement. Where do you think this is going to go? Like, where do you think that this diplomatic dispute will head? Will it escalate? Will it? Are we just in a period and it will then die down? When you look at this, what do you see coming down the road?
In the short term, I think it will escalate. I don't see China changing its position anytime soon. Also, because now we have the G7 summit coming up. We have the NATO summit coming up, and we know Korea and the AP4 have been invited to go to Lithuania. So you're going to see more statements which South Korea will sign together with other countries where China is going to be mentioned or Taiwan is going to be mentioned. We also have actually the EU Korea Summit coming up on 22nd of May. So European presidents, von der Leyen and Michel, they're going to Korea. I'm still unsure whether China will be mentioned by name, but clearly these issues of economic security, stability will be under discussion, as it's going to be next door to China. So we have 3 meetings in a row in which South Korea is going to sign up to what we assume is going to be pretty strong language on China. And some of these statements, as I said, may have China by name or may mention Taiwan by name. The discussion of, for example, the NATO summit, should Taiwan be mentioned or Taiwan Strait at the very least. Then later on, I think the issue that China has right now, it has problems with many different countries. It's not only Korea, of course, it's the US, it's Australia, Japan, of course, but also European countries. So I think what we are seeing is that many different countries, India, of course, the border dispute, have issues with China, and I don't know to what extent China can afford to have disputes with so many different countries, especially the big ones, of course, the US, but there are all these other ones, while at the same time it has to deal with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which at the very least seems China is not very comfortable with the way the invasion is going. And how some countries are calling out on China to do more to convince Putin in this case, right, to stop the invasion. So I think that in the midterm, it may that this, if it doesn't come down, or at least it quiets a little bit, because I don't think China has the bandwidth to discuss all these different disputes. And we're seeing with Europe how they're trying to change the discourse. With Europe, it's not working very well, but at least they're trying to change the message towards Europe. And my impression is that eventually they will try to do the same with other countries in Asia, in this case, including Korea.
Yeah. I mean, the thing, just for our viewers and listeners, the thing that China took most offense with in this joint statement, as well as I think in an interview that President Yoon gave, was that he referred to contingency in the Taiwan Straits as a regional and global issue, and of course China sees it entirely as a domestic issue. But I think. Just like the war in Ukraine is not a European issue, it's a global issue. Conflict in the Taiwan Straits would be a global issue, and I think that's what the Chinese take most offense at. And the Korean side has basically stood firm in terms of their belief on that. Also, you mentioned again that. We have the EU Korea Summit, May 22nd, right? We have G7 and Hiroshima, the NATO Summit plus the AP4, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea in Vilnius in Lithuania. And these may or may not make statements about Taiwan, but they will certainly make statements about economic security and economic coercion. And so what could you say a little bit about where you think the South Koreans are on this particular issue?
I think that the position right now is becoming clear that they feel threatened. I mean, they were one of the first countries that suffered Chinese economic coercion, going back to the announcement by President Park, to the deployment of TAT. So they know about it before Australia, other European countries such as Lithuania itself, for example, started to suffer the same. And I think that they feel that right now there is a framework for cooperation with the US, of course growing links that you mentioned with Japan in terms of economic security, but also with Europe, that have allowed them to diversify. Of course, there's growing investment in Southeast Asia as well, and to suffer less than they did in the past, as South Korea did in the past, from Chinese economic coercion, because it took the hit in 2016. I think many South Koreans feel that they didn't receive enough support from the international community back then. But I think now it has changed, and they feel that other countries would come in their support. And it's not only about the US, I think in this case it's about other countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, but also, as I said, from Europe as well. Plus, I think the diversification component is crucial here. And there are good business reasons why the big Chevron and other firms have been shifting part of the production networks outside of China. Supply chains, but there are also economic security reasons. And I think in a sense this has emboldened, in this case, the Yoon government to be a bit more vocal than it may have been in the past. That's something I've noticed as well. And I've noticed the increasing talk in South Korea about economic interdependence between China and South Korea. And yes, of course, China is
you
the
mean
biggest
not
market.
not economic dependence, but
exactly.
economic interdependence,
Right? And yes, China is the biggest economy and will continue to be so. But on the other hand, China needs, for example, South Korean technology, right? And it's not only about semiconductors, focus on semiconductors, but there are technologies as well that China, if it doesn't depend on South Korea, it is interdependent with South Korea. Yeah. And I think that's a change in mentality that wasn't there before, but clearly with the Yoon government. And I think other policymakers actually as well, they have been pointing this for years, but now it's government policy that allows South Korea to be more vocal and work together with other partners.
Yeah. And what about the general public in South Korea? I know that THAAD had a major impact on the way South Koreans think about China. What is the state of that today?
It's sad, you're right, but we shouldn't forget that this goes back to the time when China made some historical claims to part of the Korean Peninsula, right? The territory that most people would agree has been Korean territory for centuries, if not even longer, right? And you started to see a soaring of views, especially among the young people, but now I think is really all age groups have a negative view of China. And I think that matters because in a democracy, foreign policy at least should be in tune with public opinion, or should try to be in tune with public opinion. I think this has actually helped the Yoon government to say, well, if 80, sometimes even 90% of South Koreans express a negative view of China, we are implementing a policy that at the very least is not going to create a backlash domestically, but could actually represent the views of a majority of South Koreans. And I think that matters. And that, I think, was a major issue because many Koreans took the economic hit, and not only companies, but also the tourism sector took the economic hit. And they realized, well, this can happen at any point in time for a sovereign decision that South Korea took. Essentially, it was a sovereign decision. In the same way that China claims Taiwan is a sovereign issue, South Korea would say, well, what about that deployment then? It could be a sovereign decision from ourselves. And I don't see that changing, to be honest. I think it would be difficult to change because it's one issue after another. And now we see many South Koreans expressing their worry about Taiwan because many of them express their worry about what happened in Hong Kong. Because I know we focus a lot from outside of Korea, we focus on that because it was the big issue of many South Koreans themselves. When the crackdown on Hong Kong's liberties happened, many South Koreans were critical of it, right? And now they're concerned about what may happen in Taiwan as well. So I think there's one issue after another that there's this negative opinion among general public opinion, really.
And then there's a sort of perennial issues in South Korea-China relations that are probably viewed are framed in a different context today. So, for example, the yellow dust problem, right? That's something that's always there, but it's in a different context now. So it probably affects the Korean psyche even more. It's it is quite a long way from. I remember when South Korea normalized relations with China in 1992, and the euphoria, around the Korean Peninsula at sort of finally, after really almost half a century of non-dialogue coming out of the Korean War, that it was sort of it was like a family reunion, right? A renewal of Confucian brotherhood and sisterhood, like all this economic opportunity. It was all sort of very, very positive. And we look at the situation, 30 years later, and it's really come full circle now, both in terms of the security threat, the economic concerns, all these sorts of things, as you said, that have now penetrated down to the grassroots level, where the way people feel about these things.
Yes, something I find interesting when doing research for the book that we wrote, for example, I was looking at Kpop fandom, right? And even this fed into it, because at some point you may recall, right, China imposed restrictions on K-pop concerts in China, right? And many fans were saying, well, what are we talking about here, right? You might have a security and political dispute with us, but this should be completely separate. Your BTS or Blackpink, want to have a concert in China. Why not? But that was actually restricted. So actually these feats, right, is one thing after another that many South Koreans feel, in this case because K-pop is global, obviously, even people who are not South Korean, right, feeling what's going on here, why is this happening? And we actually saw a backlash within China, right, because also K-pop fans that were saying, well, how can this fit in relations with South Korea? It shouldn't be part of it. So I agree, it's one thing after another, right?
Interesting. Okay, so let me segue now to, well, we already talked about Yoon in Europe and Ukraine, so that was the next thing on my list, but we already talked a little bit about that. So let's finish by talking a little bit about North Korea. It's I mean, I guess it says something that when we do a lineup of different things to talk about, Korea, it ends up being at the bottom of the list rather than the top of the list. How did the North Korean government react to the summit? And secondly, like Europe has a very distinct window on North Korea because many countries have embassies there and they have people on the ground. So and of course in London there's the North Korean representation in London. So maybe you could give our viewers and listeners a view on that as well. But first, I think sort of how did they react to this big meeting between the U.S. and South Korea?
Yeah, I mean we saw the criticism coming from North Korea, which my impression is that by North Korean standards, it even went beyond a little bit what we have seen in the past, because of what we're discussing before, that the two main issues being talked about, and of course North Korea has clearly sided with Russia in its invasion of Ukraine, really one of the very few countries that has done this. But there were also the statements, as you said, that indirectly mentioned China. And I think that that's another dimension, right? That this wasn't only about North Korea, it's about U.S. and South Korea discussing North Korea, yes, but also Russia, discussing China. And of course, many people draw the relationship between three of them, the triangular relationship. And I think that has this higher dimension for North Korea as well, right? That this has been put in this group of countries that are critical, that are cooperating with Russia, with China, some people in Europe at Iran, for example, to the group as well. And I guess that's why the criticism has this other dimension. I mean, what is interesting about this is, as we say in Europe, right, because we see this even military support that we see from South Korea to the countries in Europe that are supporting Ukraine, Poland, Estonia, Norway, discussions with Romania, for example, with Turkey as well. Now I'm saying, well, there is this Cold War, so to speak, that's becoming hot between the two Koreas being played in the European continent, because we know the supply of weapons from North Korea to Russia. I think we have solid proof that this has actually happened. And I want to link this to the point that you made about the European perspective on North Korea, because as I mentioned before, it's a really secondary issue, but now North Korea's support for Russia has become another problem for Europe. It has become another problem because there was an issue with the proliferation regime and the proliferation that North Korea had, for example, to Middle Eastern countries that many Europeans feel is a potentially direct threat to Europe, never mind the threat to the global non-proliferation regime. But now with North Korea providing military support to Russia, that's directly affecting Europe, right? And it's directly affecting a European country, in this case Ukraine, plus all the countries supporting Ukraine. So what you see now is that this is another issue that Europeans want to discuss with North Korea. We have, I think, many reports that point out that North Korea should open at some point in the coming months, and there are certainly Europeans who would go back to the embassies, right? So they go back to their posts because now all of them had to leave. Right. UK, Sweden are keen on doing this, for example, but also to have North Koreans coming from Pyongyang to Europe, right? Because this hasn't happened since the pandemic started, and to see what message they want to deliver, because in the past we have seen that in private, the message that North Korea delivers is different from the public statements, right? And they try to be more nuanced, qualified, their message. So many Europeans want to hear directly from North Koreans who come from Pyongyang, because they're the ones at the end of the day who have inside information about what do they really think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because there are Europeans who think that maybe the message in private may be different from that in public. It may be that it's the same, but many Europeans feel that this could be the case.
That's interesting. Yes, I think it would be very interesting. We don't know when North Korea will open up. I know that there are many European ambassadors who are sort of waiting. I think they've all asked, right? They've all asked to go back into the country formally.
Yes.
And now they're waiting for a response. But I think that the other point about North Koreans coming back to Europe is interesting in terms of what they're willing to say. Because like you said, we actually have no idea, because of the 3-year lockdown, we have absolutely no idea what they really think about the issue. And yes, the provision of arms to Russia has brought North Korea squarely into the heart of European security concerns, which is probably not a place they want to be. If they ever had, relatively speaking, in the Western world, if they ever wanted, if they ever had a voice or an interlocutor that was, how should we say? I would not say more sympathetic, but more multi-dimensional in terms of the way they could have a conversation than the United States, because like we only have one tune, and that's denuclearization, it's nuclear weapons. But the Europeans, you could have dialogues with them on cultural issues, cultural exchanges, and on other things, not just the single nuclear issue. The North Koreans, whether intentionally or not, have really alienated that group by providing arms to Russia. So it will be interesting to see what will happen once they open up. So Ramon, it's really good to have you here in Washington D.C. I know that you have a busy day. You have another conference you need to go over at our friends at KEI. So it's a real pleasure to have you on The Impossible State. It was a lot of fun co-authoring this book with you. For our readers, for our viewers and listeners, the book is called Korea: A New History of South and North, published by Yale University Press, due out in June, appropriate for the 70th anniversary of the armistice of the Korean War. Again, thanks again for being with us, viewers and listeners. Thank you for following us on another episode of The Impossible State, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much.